Hi again. This is video number 3, and we're going to continue with our analysis of inductive arguments. And we're on analogical arguments. It's to compare the strength of one analogical argument with another. There's several things that we have to look at. Now, all of these are what you might call common sense references or rules, if you want to call them that. And so that we have to use our own common sense to judge them. But there's going to be an example on your quiz that will ask you a number of questions that relate to this. So let's go back to the analogical argument between Cheryl and Denise, and we decided that there were enough similarities between the two to reach the conclusion that Denise would also like the Chronicles of Narnia. Okay, so what are the things that might affect that or change it? Well, one thing is that if there are more related similarities, for example, in addition to all the ones that we mentioned, Cheryl likes to read the same books, or Denise likes to read the same books as Cheryl, and that they also like to visit the same websites. And so those would be some additional similarities, and that would make the conclusion that Denise would like the Chronicles of Narnia even stronger. Okay, so analogical argument can be stronger or weaker depending upon the similarities or dissimilarities between, in this case, Cheryl and Denise, or we'll call those the analogs or terms of the argument. Okay, the same thing is true that if there are fewer relevant dissimilarities. In other words, if there's very little that is different between Cheryl and Denise, then that would also tend to make the argument or the conclusion that she would like the Chronicles stronger. So more similarities and fewer dissimilarities. Okay. Now, another thing that would also strengthen the argument is more diversity. Like I added in the example I just gave a couple minutes back, I added the fact that they both like the same websites and they both like to read the same books. Okay, so those are similarities that increase the diversity. In other words, that diversity would mean that they are alike in lots of different ways. And so the more they are alike in lots of different ways, the stronger the conclusion. And so diversity can also strengthen the argument. And then finally, if Cheryl and Denise are part of a large family where they have a couple more sisters, and if all of them are similar enough that they all like the Chronicles of Narnia, then that strengthens the argument that Denise would also like it. And so if you flip any of those things over to the opposite, those would give you reasons for weakening the argument. Okay, now here is a relatively complex item. So when we make our sample, and perhaps we draw 1,000 people into our sample, we select 1,000. It turns out that there's a factor which is called random variation. Now, normally when these questions are actually done, is they take many, many samples. They don't sample just one time, but they sample several times. depending upon how much money they have. So it turns out that the results from each sample may not be identical. In fact, they are usually not identical. But if they are representative, in other words, if the sample is done correctly, the difference between the samples will not be that great. For example, if we do a sample having 1,000 people in it, and the sample is a representative one, we will see it vary from one sample to another, what is called plus or minus 3%, so that some of the samples will come out with 52% Democrats, and another sample might come out with 58%, and the results will tend to stay between those two numbers. So we call that a plus or minus variation, and that's called the error margin, or sometimes it's called the margin of error. And so in order to represent that, when we report the results of our sampling, that there will be a result, like say in this case 55%, but they'll also say plus or minus 3. So that means that the random variation was between 52 and 58. And if you watch TV and you see about samples or on the internet, that you will see that they always give a figure of plus or minus 3. Or in this, it depends on how large the sample size is. The larger it is, the smaller the random variation is, or we call that the error margin. And so if it turns out that that's what we're getting, then we develop a certain amount of confidence level. And if we take, in other words, a certain confidence that the results are going to be what we're saying they are. And so we're saying that the results are 55 plus or minus 3. So how confident can we be of that? Well, the math on that works out that statistically our results are going to come out that way 95% of the time. Or in other words, if we take 20 samples, 19 of them will fall within the plus or minus 3 range. There will be one that will not. It may be lower or higher, and there's really no way to account for that. It just is what happens when we make selections, when we do sampling that way. So if we have a 95% confidence level, that means we think that 19 out of 20 will come within that plus or minus 3, and there will be 1 out of 20 that either is, that probably jumps way outside. So the error margin is the plus or minus 3. The confidence level is the number of samples that we take on how confident we can be that they're correct. In this case, the confidence level was 95%, so that 19 times out of 20, we will get the results that we're predicting. And then there's random variation, which is the reason why this these numbers go up and down. And sometimes, like we say, there will be one sample that will jump way outside what is predicted. And that will be, in this case, 5% of the time. So what we usually do is ignore that and call that an artifact, and take into account the other 95% or the other 19.